Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. The last time I spoke with today's guest, it was late September of 2021, and I started the podcast by citing recent FBI crime data. Quote, the murder rate increased by 30% from 2019 to 2020, meaning that 4,900 more people were killed in homicides in 2020 than the year prior. That amounts to the largest single-year increase since records began in 1960. Okay, so that was then. The story today is quite different. Data from the first half of this year suggests that the U.S. is on track to have the largest one-year drop in murder on record for the third straight year. The absolute numbers are also remarkable. Los Angeles, Baltimore, and Detroit have all recorded the fewest murders at this point in the year since the mid-1960s. San Francisco has recorded the fewest murders ever, and so has New York, spare 1 year, 2017. Violent crime more broadly and property crime are also at or near historic lows. It's a major success story that has already attracted competing explanations and ideological debate. It's also gone largely unnoticed by Americans. 64% say there is more crime now than there was last year. Although that's a noticeable drop from 2023, when 77% said there was more crime, it still leaves the majority of Americans with the wrong impression. Here with me to talk all about it is Jeff Asher. He's worked as a data analyst for the New Orleans Police Department and the CIA. He's also the co-founder of Datalytics and writes about crime data at Jeffalytics on Substack. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
So, are you surprised that the murder and violent crime rates have continued to drop this quickly for now a third year in a row?
I'd like to say no and then ask nobody to go read my Substack starting in early January when I sort of let out forecasts for 2025 and definitely said I thought that these trends would start to peter out and showed we think we see some evidence that we're seeing sort of maybe not a reversal in the trends, but a less steep decline coming. Then 2025 started and everything got much more accelerated. And it's of course surprising. You study these things, typically they go up or down by a couple of percentage points in a given year. And so anytime you get something that's historic, anytime you get something that's really big, you're surprised. And so the kind of my prior is, okay, we're seeing a historic decline this year. Next year, we're not going to do that. Next year, we're going to see it go back to normal. And that's not at all what we've seen.
We're only halfway through the year, though. Your latest analysis was pretty confident that the trend will hold. Why is that?
Because historically, the trend tends to hold this late in the year. And usually once you get past kind of the first 4 months of the year, your trend is not set in stone, but the general direction is. And if you think about it, right now, about half of the murders that are going to occur this year have already occurred. We're generally seeing the same trend we've seen for 2.5 years. So it's not just like we've seen 5-6 months of data this year that stands in contrast to what we saw last year, which stands in contrast to the year before. We're seeing a continuation of the trend. And generally, it's like a cruise ship, a big ship. It takes a while for these things to turn around. So the data through this point in the year is typically actually pretty predictive of the end of the year. And the data that we have available is typically pretty good at predicting what the FBI official stats will show.
I cited some of the murder numbers in particular, but did all types of crime spike around 2020, 2021? And is all crime falling now?
So the answer to the first question is no. In general, violent crime, I wouldn't say spiked. It rose a couple of percentage points in 2020. Murder spiked. Murder went up 30%, but murder makes up a tiny portion of overall crime. It's the property crime that did the opposite. You think of the pandemic, if there's no tourists on Bourbon Street, you can't really have many pickpockets. So we saw in most cities this huge decline in property crime starting in 2020, with the exception of auto theft. And in general, property crime fell a lot in 2020, kind of returned to normal through 2022, and then has been falling the last few years. So it's definitely, whenever we would do these conversations back in 2020 and 2021, people would talk about surging crime in America. And the caveat in me would always rise that, well, crime is not surging, murder is surging. There is strong evidence, if you kind of do the back of the napkin math, that we'll have the lowest murder rate ever recorded in 2025, which is just incredible to think about based on kind of your opener where we talked about September 2021, where things stood, to be 4 years later and potentially be talking about the lowest murder rate ever recorded.
Do we have an agreed upon understanding of why violent crime, and in particular murder, went up in the first place?
There's a bunch of theories. There are some ideas that are, I think, better than others. But in general, there's certainly no common understanding of why things went up or down. It frequently becomes a political talking point, and I don't think that's helpful for anybody. But I think that the ultimate answer probably lies with a whole bunch of little things rather than one single thing that caused it. And the metaphor I give is that, like, if you gave me the world's greatest chocolate cake recipe and you said, here are the ingredients, go make the cake, I couldn't do that. Similarly, we kind of have an understanding of what some of the ingredients were, but it's a very difficult cake to bake because we don't necessarily know exactly what order they went in, how much, what was the most important, what was the least important, things like that.
Okay, so can we try to hone in on some of those ingredients? Like, are there particular explanations that have strong ties to data or evidence?
So the answers that I tend to prefer are ones that explain why it was national. And the rise and subsequent fall of murder is the greatest success has many fathers, failures an orphan issue in that I'm aware of. Because there's no city in America saying it's because of X, Y, and Z that we did. And every city in America now is saying it's going down because of X, Y, and Z that we're doing. So the strongest explanations need to explain the fact that it was national. They need to explain the fact that it really started the May, June 2020 timeframe. So it wasn't snap, there was a pandemic, and then we saw this big increase. The explanation that I prefer basically is that, the murder of George Floyd happens in late May, and people react to that. And the reaction is a large drop in this idea of police legitimacy. So if you don't think that the police are going to bring legitimacy to this case, they're not going to solve this case, it creates cycles of violence. It creates retribution killings. It leads to people feeling less safe, carrying guns more often. At the same time, you've got the protests against police. You have police in a lot of cities pulling back, both because of the protests and because of just general COVID responses. And so you definitely see a lot less happening. I'm not someone that believes that, that there's some magic switch for policing that they can turn off. And if they turn it off, then all of a sudden people start killing each other, and then they can turn it back on when they feel respected and people stop killing each other. But I do think that you definitely saw less policing. You saw less huge drop in clearance rates. So lots of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily want to see in society, you started to see. And then you have this issue of all of these guns that we know that there was this huge surge in firearm purchases in the start of 2020. And Rob Arthur and we did an analysis that looked at the share of arrests that were leading to a firearm arrest in stops, with the idea being that if police were assuming that police hadn't changed who they were stopping and they hadn't suddenly become very good at figuring out which car had a firearm in it, the percentage of those should be relatively stable. And for the most part, for years, they were stable. The start of 2020, you started to see this big increase in the share of stops that was leading to a firearm being found. And so that suggests that people were carrying all of these firearms, which by itself did not cause the increase, but kind of acted as this accelerant on all of this other stuff that was happening. And then you throw on top of that all of the programs, all of the city services that we would have relied on to interrupt these cycles of violence, community violence interrupters, all of this stuff was not useful or was much more limited in its use thanks to the pandemic. And so once this surge began, we had fewer tools in the tool chest to respond to it. That is, I think, the most compelling story for why we saw an increase. Obviously, I'm telling the story that I find the most compelling. I'm not saying that there are not other people with other good ideas that are also not or that are also potentially compelling, but I think that helps to explain why it was national, why the timing was where it was, and why it got so badly out of control.
Are there any explanations that you didn't mention that you think are worth considering in baking the cake, even if they're not sort of the best connected to the data that you have?
I think the explanation that I would like to see tested in data that, as far as I know, is not, is that the court system basically shut down.